So, check this out, people. Recently, if you turn on the news, you may or may not hear this, right? But Puerto Rico wants to be independent of the US, right? Now, I've heard about this for years, since I was a little boy. I would see graffiti signs in the Bronx that said, Puerto Rico libre, right? Puerto Rico free, right? Now, I never understood what that meant. I would always say, Puerto Rico is free. I don't understand what this means, right? But as I got older, I learned to understand that the meaning of that was that Puerto Rico wanted its independence from the US, right? The same way it received its independence from Spain some 200 years ago, right? And so if you Google Puerto Rico and Trump, or if you Google Puerto Rico free, independence, whatever, you're going to come up with an article where two governors of Puerto Rico are putting into effect, or want to put into effect, the independence of Puerto Rico, right? Now, I'm not for that. And I'm going to tell you why I don't agree with the independence of Puerto Rico. First of all, Puerto Rico is independent. We are a territory of the US. And because of that, we have access to the same freedoms, the same rights as national-born Americans who were born in the mainland, right? In the US, the 50 states. And Puerto Rico, which is the only Caribbean island that has access to the same rights and the same freedoms as Americans, is a blessing, right? Because Puerto Rico is the richest of all of the Caribbean islands, and that is because it has the backing of America, right? And if it wasn't for the US, we'd still be under Spanish rule. Up until the US fought during the Spanish-American War back in the 17 or 1800s, where they helped us gain our independence. And though many may say, well, we're not independent because we are a US territory, I want Puerto Ricans who are living in Puerto Rico and who live in the US, right, in the 50 states, to understand this. Why do you think it's going to happen if Puerto Rico gains its independence? Do you think that Puerto Ricans will still have access to the mainland, the 50 states, without needing a passport to enter into the US? Because right now, Puerto Ricans don't need a passport to go into America. We have the same rights, the same passports, the same non-restrictions as all national-born Americans, and we're not even born in the 50 states. So, do you believe that if Puerto Rico gains its independence, we're going to lose that ability to travel to and from Puerto Rico, in and out of Puerto Rico, to anywhere we want in the country, in the world, using a passport that's issued by America? Because these are privileges that are given to us by America. We have the privilege to own an American passport. I wasn't born in the States. I was born in Puerto Rico. My daughters are first generation born American nationals here in the 50 states of the US. And my family, my brothers and sisters, my mother, my father, we were and are from the island of Puerto Rico. And so I want to understand, if Puerto Rico gains its independence, its freedom, if you want to call it that, from the US as a territory, do we lose the American dollar? Do we lose our abilities to come in and out of the mainland, the 50 states, without needing a passport? The way Cubans need a passport, the way Jamaicans, Dominicans, and every other person in the Caribbean needs a passport to enter the U.S., unlike Puerto Ricans, which we don't need one. What happens to the American dollar? What happens to the programs? What happens to the backing that we have from the U.S.? Because even though Puerto Rico is the richest of the Caribbean islands, it's still not where it should be, right? As far as standards, as far as riches, right? There are many poor people in Puerto Rico, poor to the standards of modern life today, right? Because to me, we're not poor. When you live off the land, when you have your pigs, your chickens, your farm, and you're living the same way you've been living for hundreds of years, you're not poor. You're only poor because you can't afford a 50-inch screen television. And that's not poverty to me, that's nonsense. But the fact is that we're living in a modern world where people believe that poverty means not having things like an AC, like a 50-inch screen television, a car, but yet you have the means to farm, to own your own land, to raise your pigs, your chickens, to farm, and live off the land and never go hungry, but yet you call yourself impoverished. And that to me doesn't make sense, right? But aside from that, right, I mean, that's one of the reasons why the Spanish called Puerto Rico, rich port. It's not because it was rich in gold and silver, but because the land is rich in how people grow their crops. You don't have to do anything. You just have to plant the seed and walk away, and the land does everything for you. But what happens if Puerto Rico gains its independence? Do we lose that American dollar? Do we lose the ability to travel to and from the U.S. freely and to other countries as American citizens? Because we Puerto Ricans, though we are not part of the U.S., we're just a territory, we are considered American nationals because we are an indigenous people. We are native to the land of Puerto Rico, and since we are under American control, we are given the same rights as American citizens, as Native Americans, indigenous people. We have the right to have the same rights as all Americans. So why would we give up our independence from the U.S. to become independent of what? Independent from what? How is our lives going to get better if we become independent, not just from Spain, which we have been for hundreds of years, but from the U.S.? How is that going to make the country better? How is that going to gain or create jobs for Puerto Ricans and stability? How is that going to help those who are poor? I'm trying to understand why people, especially people who have no education, because the majority of people who are always calling for the independence of Puerto Rico are people who have no idea how America works or how the system works, but who depend on the system and yet at the same time want to be free from the system, a system that's been provided for them for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. Because if you think that being independent of the U.S. is going to make Puerto Ricans' lives better, I don't think so. I don't think so. Because there are many people, if not 80% of Puerto Ricans, who rely on welfare, food stamps, Medicaid, free medical, free dental, and again, the ability to travel to and from the mainland and have access to the same medical as every other American and not have to pay out of pocket. What do you think is going to happen if you become independent, Puerto Rico? You're going to have to pay up the butt just to have a surgery that most likely you may not be able to have in the island, in Puerto Rico, but might have to come into the mainland in the U.S. to have that same surgery that might end up costing you. I mean, it doesn't make sense to want to be separated from the U.S. We're not a state. we govern ourselves, other than the backing of the American dollar, the American president, the American people, what are we going to become independent to? What? The freedom to be impoverished, just like every other Caribbean island? The ability to not have the American passport, not be able to come to and from the mainland freely, not to have access to medical, to dental freely, and the benefits that all Americans have. That is the stupidest thing, I believe, that any Puerto Rican can vote for, is the independence of Puerto Rico. I believe Puerto Ricans have prospered, and again, is the richest island in all of the Caribbean because of the American dollar, because of the backing of the U.S. And if we try to separate from that, we are going to lose the same privileges that we've earned by allowing the U.S. to have their presence there, right? And us to be a territory of the U.S. and have their backing, not just with the American dollar, but the military. Because remember, Puerto Rico is just as small as Cuba, if not smaller. I don't really know. But we have the American backing, the Army, the American Army's backing. Privileges that most people in the world would dream of. I mean, I don't think Puerto Ricans understand the privilege that we have to be a part of the U.S. And again, we're not a state, so the fact that we're crying for independence doesn't make any sense to me. Independence to what? Poverty? The Puerto Rican dollar? Puerto Rican currency, which is not going to have any value to the American dollar? You have to use common sense, people. We cannot vote Puerto Rico to separate itself from the U.S. We need the U.S. The whole world needs the U.S., but especially Puerto Ricans. We don't have to be separate from the U.S. to know our place, to know who we are, to know what we are as a people, as a nation of Boricuas. And so I don't agree with Puerto Rico becoming independent. I believe that's going to destroy us as a people. I believe that's going to open the door to other countries to try to manipulate us and invade us. I don't trust any government, not the American government, let alone the Spanish government or any other government that wants to govern Puerto Rico outside of the U.S. The U.S. did not invade Puerto Rico. The U.S. invaded Spain and freed us from the Spanish. I don't understand the stupidity when I see on Facebook or anywhere how the U.S. took Puerto Rico. Took it from who? From us? We didn't run Puerto Rico. The Spanish ran Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans have never been independent, ever. Up until 1492, when Columbus discovered it, Puerto Rico has been under Spanish rule. And because of Americans, we've been truly independent. And to separate ourselves from that dependency and become independent of the U.S., I believe is going to open doors to other countries to reinvade us because of the strategic place in which the island sits. That is why Puerto Rico is an important land for the U.S. And I believe we need the U.S. So people, tell me what you think. Should Puerto Rico become independent, or should Puerto Rico remain a territory of the U.S.? Leave a comment and tell me what you think.